Welcome back to this week's lecture, which is on ancient Greece. And this will be a two-part lecture. The first part will go down through about the classical period, and then the second part will be the classical period down to the takeover of Alexander the Great. And what you're looking at here is a vase, and these are fairly common even in smaller museums today, primarily because they were given as prizes to athletes. And then what would happen is when the athlete died, these vases would be buried with them, and then they survive up through the time of excavations of their grave sites. And if you look close enough, you can see this is a scene from the Iliad, which was written by Homer, showing Achilles, very famous character from the Iliad, and Ajax playing a board game that's described in the book. And here we have our standard timeline, so I will briefly talk about the Bronze Age, just very briefly. And then we'll move right into the Mycenaean period, which runs to about 1100. And within that period, you've got the very famous battle, if it did happen, the Battle of Troy, or the Trojan War. Then we'll talk a little bit about the Dark Age of Greece, which is sort of a fascinating time point when Greek society essentially collapses. At least that's what it's thought. Then we move into the Archaic Period, which is when Greece starts organizing itself again, and you get the reintroduction of writing. Of course, the most famous period in Greek history is the Classical Period. We'll spend a couple of minutes talking about that. And then we'll move on to the Hellenistic Period, where you've got Alexander the Great, who is not Greek, he's a Macedonian, and his father, Philip II, come in and take over Greece. Here you've got a map of Greece, and Greece is fairly small in terms of overall size. It's fairly mountainous, and it's got some deep valleys. And Greece is pretty interesting because the geography itself plays a really important part in the style of government that the Greeks end up choosing, which is a city-state. And we've talked about city-states before. So it's just easier for someone to control, say, like a valley, as opposed to controlling a mountain and then the valley next to it. So you've got the creation of these city-states. So very famous city-states, you've got Sparta in the southern part of an area called the Peloponnese. You've got Mycenae, which we'll talk about, and I'll point this out on, I think, in my next scene. And of course, you've got Athens. In sort of the center north, you've got Delphi, where the very famous Oracle of Apollo is located. You also have the Aegean Sea, and then right across from that, you've got modern-day Turkey. This is also a place that the Greeks ended up populating, and of course all of the Greek islands. Before we start with the Mycenaean period, I just want to talk a little bit about the influences. So of course, all people are influenced by other groups, and you've got contacts of the Greeks with a lot of different civilizations. So you've got contacts with the Hittites. You have contacts with the Egyptians, and it's thought that possibly Greeks learned a lot of their architecture from the Egyptians. And you've got the Phoenicians, very important group, and we've already talked about them, with the interaction between the Phoenicians and the Greeks in terms of learning this new alphabet. And then it's possible you've got a link with the Babylonians and the use of math. Let's move into one of the earliest periods in Greek history, which is considered to be a high point, and that is the Mycenaean period. And the Mycenaean era is named after the city-state of Mycenae, and I'll show you that on a map in just a bit. I've given you the dates here, around 1500 to about 1100 BC. Now, if you remember, the very first, or the second scene of this video talked about the Bronze Age, which lasts from about 3000 BC to about 1100 BC. The Mycenaean period is the late Bronze Age, meaning bronze isn't being used as much, and they're moving into the next usage of a metal, which is iron. And when we talk about the Dark Age of Greece, I'll explain why iron is being used much more than bronze during this period. But anyway, the Mycenaean period is considered to be a high point because you have these massive city-states, you have a lot of trades, you've got strong economies, you've got fairly strong governments, and it's named again after the city-state of Mycenae. And if you remember your Indian history, we talked about the Harappan civilization and how it was named after one city. And the idea behind that is culture in Harappa spread up and down the Indus River Valley. So it's called the Harappan civilization. This is the same here. Mycenae was a very influential city during this period, and it influenced culture in a large part of Greece. And here you have a map that points out where Mycenae is. So it sits sort of in between the city-state of Sparta and the city-state of Athens. It's located technically in the Peloponnese. Here you have a very famous photo of the city-state of Mycenae. And what you're looking at, it's up on the top of a hill, which is fairly typical in terms of ancient cities. The whole site is surrounded by a massive wall, massive city wall, which they actually extended into the right side of this slide. So if you can see that little circular area, that's where they started burying their kings. And originally that wasn't surrounded by a city wall, but they eventually put a wall around that, probably to prevent grave robbing. And one other thing to notice on this slide, you only have really one way in, and that's something called the Lion's Gate, which I will show you a slide in just a bit. Let's talk a little bit about what we know in terms of the government during the Mycenaean period. You've got local rulers. Now remember, this is a city-state. You also have writing, and this is something called Linear B. This was really a writing that was borrowed from the Minoans, who were living on the island of Crete, and they wrote in something called Linear A, which we can't translate, or we haven't translated yet. Linear B you can definitely read. And it was used primarily for government documents like tax receipts and letters, but you don't find literature. You also have a standard hierarchy here. So you've got a king at the top, you've got the administrators who can write, you've got priests, and then you've got everyone else. So pretty standard in terms of the setup of a government. Here you've got the roadway that leads up to the main way to get into Mycenae, which is called the Lion's Gate. And I've got a series of shots that will show you why it's called that. But if you look sort of in the center middle, just above the actual gate itself, you can see two lions there. Here you're closer still, and here you can see that there are fairly large blocks that were being used by the Mycenaean Greeks, and you can tell that just by the size of the people. And again, just above the gateway opening, you can see these two lions. Finally, here's a close-up of the actual Lion's Gate. You can see the two lions, and it's thought that these probably had some type of gold leafing on them, so they're probably much more impressive then than they are today. And here's a photo of just inside the gate, so the back of the actual Lion's Gate. And this was really built for defense. So of course you've got the city wall, you've got one way into the city. If enemies got to the gate and broke it down, you could still have soldiers up above tossing things down. So again, city walls just show defense, but if you get through that, you can try to defend the city from inside. This is a shot of the wall, so the city wall. Now, this city did not disappear under the sands over time. It was actually there even during the time of the classical period, and the classical Greeks knew about it, but they looked at those stones and said their ancestors could have no way have built a city wall with blocks that size. And so you get this sort of common story that these city walls were built by the Cyclops. And if you know anything about the Cyclops, it's a giant with one eye. So therefore they started calling these walls the Cyclopean fortification wall of Mycenae. Now of course that story isn't true. We know the Mycenaean Greeks had the technology to work on these large stones. This is just a shot of the grand staircase that leads up to the palace. Here you have one of the more interesting areas of Mycenae. And if you remember when I was talking about the city walls, I had mentioned that they buried their kings outside the city walls and eventually enclosed that. This is something called a grave circle. And you can see that they're actually a circle. In the next scene, I'll show you a close-up of one of these. And you have pit burials here, meaning they dug a trench, put the body down at the bottom, and then covered it up, and then surrounded it by these double walls. And they found, I think, 16 bodies in here so far, mostly men, but they do have some women. And in the next couple scenes, I'll show you some of the material that was taken out of these grave sites. Here's another shot of the grave circle. This is grave circle A. And here you've got some material that was taken out of the grave sites. These objects are called rhytins. And if you grasped, especially the one on the left, by the nose and flipped it up, it would act as a cup. And so what they would do is they would pour wine into these things. They'd make their requests to the gods. And then their sacrifice would be to pour the wine on the ground, which would be a sacrifice to the gods. And if you remember the picture I showed you of Croesus, where he's sitting on the funeral pyre, he's doing the exact same thing. He's got a rhytin in his hand, and he's dumping wine onto his own funeral pyre. These are two bronze daggers that were found in these grave sites, and if you look closely you can see they have hunting scenes on them. You have many gold objects being found in these grave sites, and these, even though it looks like a crown, it's not really a crown. It is fairly thin gold, and then other decorative objects made out of gold. Here's the most famous object that was taken from the gravesite. This is a grave mask. So they found this on top of a body covering the face. And Schliemann is the name of the archaeologist who was doing work here. And he discovered this, and he thought what he was looking at was the face of Agamemnon. Now, I haven't mentioned this before, but the city-state of Mycenae, if you read the Iliad, is the traditional home of Agamemnon. So Schliemann was hoping to find real characters of that story to convince people that it actually was a real-life account of a war. Unfortunately for Schliemann, when this was dated, it was dated to about 1400 BC. And if the Trojan War happened, that was about 200 years after that, or about 1200 BC. But this is still called the face of Agamemnon. The Mycenaean period was considered to be a great period, or a high point, because of their great economy they had. And most of that was based on trade. So Greece, again, was not very big, and they had to trade with a lot of different civilizations. And here's just a picture of something called lapis lazuli, which a lot of civilizations wanted. And I give you a list at the top of this slide of some things that they were trading for. Let's move to the other side of the Aegean and look at Troy. So Troy is directly across from Greece on mainland Turkey. And what you're looking at here is something called the Trench of Schliemann. So Schliemann was the same archaeologist who worked in Mycenae. He also worked at Troy. And he was originally told to be very careful with the site because no one had done archaeology here. And he wasn't. He ended up digging a trench along the whole top and destroying layers and layers of material. In fact, there's a story about, in his diary, he writes about destroying a Neolithic building that stood 10 feet tall, and now there's no evidence of that other than the small bit that he put in his diary. So he did a lot of damage, not seen as a very good archaeologist, but he did discover quite a few objects from this site. What you're looking at here is an artist's drawing of the different layers of the hill of Troy. And if you look down at the bottom left, where there's just sort of a small village there, that's Troy 1. And if you count, there are actually 9 layers here up to Troy 9. It's thought that the Trojan War, if it did happen, happened around Troy 6, which is the one that sort of have the red triangle here. And don't write all these dates down. I'm just giving you this timeline of the separate layers from Troy in case you're reading any secondary material like archaeological reports that talk about something like Troy 2, which is 2600 to 2300, or Troy 9, which is the Roman period. And you definitely have Roman graves at this site. Sometimes when you look at a site, you can tell what was going on. And this is a cross-section of an early part of Troy, where if you look close enough, you can see a dark area. It's sort of a dark, smudgy area. This is evidence of a giant fire. So sometime during Troy 2, which is fairly early, long before the Trojan War, if it actually happened, probably about 1,000 years before, you had a fairly large fire, burned a lot of buildings, and then people just rebuilt on top of that. This again is just an artist's representation of what they thought Troy would look like during the Trojan War, which is Troy 6. We don't know whether the Trojan War actually took place. Homer tells us about it, but he was writing about 400 years after this so-called war. But you can look at other pieces of evidence that might suggest something was going on. So during Troy 6, which is when it was thought the war was happening, people who were living there were reinforcing their walls. And you have to wonder, why would you reinforce a wall? Well, maybe you were being invaded and you had to make the walls stronger to make sure they stood up from these invaders, which is one possibility. Maybe the walls were just falling down and they needed replacement or reinforcement. So anyway, we don't know if the Trojan War actually took place, but it's a possibility that it did. The next section of Mycenaean history, or Greek history, is the beginning of the Dark Age. And something is happening around 1200 BC. It's happening to the Hittites. We know that the Egyptians were having trouble with a group of people called the Sea People. And the same problem was happening to Greece. So starting around 1200 BC, you've got a general collapse of these city-states and a collapse of the economy. If you look at the archaeological record, you can see that luxury goods like bathtubs and beautiful pottery, they were starting to disappear, so luxuries were disappearing. You can also see this with pottery styles. So at the high point of the Mycenaean period, you've got beautiful pottery. During this period, you don't. People are just barely surviving and they don't have time to make pretty pots, so they just make something utilitarian. You can also look at more archaeology that shows you that cultivation was going down. So something pretty serious was happening during this period. Another really interesting thing is that writing is forgotten. So if you remember, the Greeks were writing in Linear B, and during the Dark Age and after, they forget how to write. Now, the main reason for that is because it's a government language. So if you don't have a government, there's no reason to write in Linear B, and there's certainly no reason to teach people this particular language. So again, you've got the fall of Mycenaean Greece causing lots of problems. Other civilizations are having trouble. Now make sure you read the Stanislavski article. We'll talk about this in the discussion. He has a slightly different view. Now he doesn't suggest that the Dark Age didn't happen, but what he says is during this Dark Age, it was an age of enlightenment, which is very different from the other article I want you to read, which is written by a man with the last name of Buck. The next phase of Greek history is called the Archaic Period. So you've got the Mycenaean Period, you've got the Dark Age, and now the Archaic Period. And this is a period when you get the Greeks coming together again. So they're starting to reorganize their governments that had collapsed during the Dark Age. And I've given you the dates here. What you find is that in the city-states, or the rise of the city-state again is happening, and you've got a group of people called the aristocracy who starts to rule these city-states. Now, I'm sure you've heard of the word aristocrat. In Greek, aristos means the best. So aristocrat is technically the best, and aristocracy is the rule of the best. Now, these best could be rich people, they could be people who had links to the time period before the Dark Age. We're not quite sure. But regardless of that, we know in the Archaic Period populations are growing. And you can look at the size of villages, the size of these city-states, you can look at grave sites and so on. Remember we talked about how this was the Late Bronze era. Now what happens in Greece is that if you remember, bronze is made out of tin and copper. Now you've got copper deposits in Greece, but you don't have a lot of tin. So during the Dark Age, trade collapsed along with the economies. So without tin, you can't make bronze. So the Greeks were sort of left to themselves, and they had iron deposits. Now iron is a harder metal once you make it. It's also a bit more difficult in terms of technology to create iron. But iron is something you can dig out of the ground, smelt it, pound it, and then make it into various objects. So this is really the beginning of the Iron Age in Greece. Another really interesting thing, and we've talked about this before, so the Phoenicians are sending out colonists. The Greeks too are sending out colonists during the late Dark Age, the early Archaic Period, and they're meeting up with the Phoenicians, and the Phoenicians write, as you know. The Greeks see this writing and they adopt it. So if you're taking notes right now, this script that you're writing in goes all the way back to the Phoenicians, which was adopted by the Greeks. So writing was relearned, a different script than Linear B, and you find people like Homer starting to write the Iliad in that new script. We know a little bit about the government during this period. So if you remember, I told you it was ruled by an aristocracy. Now at some early point, the aristocrats chose one of their own to become king. Now this didn't last very long, which I'll mention in just a bit. But you also have, and I want to, before I get into this, I want to focus on the city-state of Athens. This is when Athens becomes extremely important, and it's the one city that we have the most evidence for. So we know that there was a council of these aristocrats who were advising the king. The name of this particular group is called Areopagus. Now, Pagus means hill. And I don't know if you look at this word, you might be able to recognize a word for one of the Greek gods, which is Ares. And Ares was the war god. So this literally means, the Areopagus literally means hill of Ares. So these people undoubtedly were discussing issues of military with the king. Now we know at some point the aristocrats decided they really didn't need a king, even though they chose one. So they could rule the city-state without a king, and then they get rid of the king. So if you think about the evolution of the Greek government, you've got kings, and then of course you have a Dark Age. You're not quite sure what was happening during that period. But then you've got aristocrats, kings again, and then back to an aristocracy. Moving into the later Archaic Period, you find the Greeks having to deal with a number of people who want to take power away from the aristocrats. These people are called proto-tyrants, and I'll talk about what a tyrant means in just a bit. But one of the earlier men to do this was a man named Cylon. So I've given you his dates here. He was fairly famous in Athens. He was an Olympic athlete. He was a runner, and he won his competition and became rich and famous, much like Olympic athletes do today. He decided to use that fame to try and seize the Acropolis, which is a tall hill in Athens. It's where all the government and religious buildings were. So he thinks his popularity will help him. So he tries to take over the Acropolis, and he's not successful. So Cylon is considered to be a proto-tyrant, or an early version of tyranny. And what you see after this is that the Greeks trying to figure out how to prevent one person from taking power. One person who does this is a man named Draco. And you might have heard the word draconian. And if you think about a draconian ruler, is someone who is pretty awful at ruling and treats his people terribly. Now Draco sort of gets this, it's not really fair to name that particular word after him, but he passed quite a few laws during his period. Now he was not a tyrant, so he was part of the aristocracy. He was just elected to run the city-state of Athens for a period of time. One of his laws said that if you owed a debt, you could be sold into slavery. So it's much like today, if you have a credit card bill and you can't pay it, it would mean that the credit card company could come and grab you and then sell you off into slavery to make the money. That was not very popular for a large number of people. One thing that Draco did that sort of carries down into our period is that he devised intention into the law. So, you know, we've got like first-degree murder and manslaughter. So first-degree murder is where you plan out a murder. So you'd buy a gun. You know who you're going to kill. You know where they're going to be at a certain time, and you're there, and then you kill them. That's first-degree murder. Manslaughter is something like an accident where you back your car up and kill somebody. So there's differences in the penalties in terms of intent, and this is what Draco gives us. Solon comes along, and he's considered to be the lawgiver of Athens. He does something called the shaking off the debt, and if what this does is he told the poor people that if they owe anything to anybody, then the debt is canceled. So going back to the credit card example, if you owed $10,000 on your credit card, Solon would say you owe nothing tomorrow. So you would get rid of your debt. One thing Solon did is he got rid of that slavery debt law that Draco had. So he said Athenian citizens could not be sold into slavery if they couldn't pay their debt. And again, you know, remember Draco and Solon what they're trying to do is to essentially give poor people a better chance in terms of a say of their government. Now, really quickly, what I want to do is talk about Pisistratus. So Pisistratus is considered to be the first tyrant. And Pisistratus, or let me talk about tyrant first. So the definition of a tyrant in ancient Greece is a person who takes power illegally. So today it's a horrible ruler, but in ancient Greece it's a person who takes power legally. He actually seizes power 3 times. So he comes into power about 560, not quite sure the exact date. He stays for a bit, the aristocracy gets together and they send him into exile. So he goes into exile, he comes back into power for a second time, he gets remarried, and for whatever reason he doesn't have sex with his second wife. So she doesn't like it, she complains to her father, who is an aristocrat, and Pisistratus gets exiled again. So he goes off into exile, he makes a lot of money in a silver mine, comes back into Athens, and the next scene that I have is a definition of a tyrant, and then after that I'm going to show you a bit of a long text by a man named Herodotus, who's considered to be the father of history. He writes about how Pisistratus came back into power for the 3rd time. Here we've got the definition of a tyrant as described by Aristotle. And if you notice, there's a word named demos, which we'll talk about in just a bit, but I'm hoping you can see the root of democracy here. So demos is the tribe of people. And here you've got a fairly long text written by Herodotus, who wrote a book called Histories. He really wrote the first history. So what you'll need to do is stop the video and actually read through this. But this is the description by Herodotus of how Pisistratus came back into power, which is sort of an interesting use of theater. And I should say, it actually worked. He got back into power for the 3rd time, and then he dies a natural death. So as I just mentioned, Pisistratus dies a natural death, and he has 2 sons, and they take over as tyrants. Now at first they were sort of the good type of tyrants, just like their father, but Hipparchus was killed during a religious procession, and after that his brother Hippias became fairly paranoid, and he becomes what we would call a bad tyrant. So he became very paranoid about his rule, didn't want to share his rule with anybody else. If you remember, I mentioned that a tyrant today means a bad ruler. In ancient Greece, it means a person who took power legally, and that was Pisistratus and his sons. Now, Pisistratus was actually a good ruler, considered to be a good ruler, because he takes a lot of his wealth and he builds up Athens and makes it a major city. Now, this is the Acropolis, as it looks like today. Now, it did not look totally like this during the time of Pisistratus, especially the beautiful building in sort of the upper center, which is the Parthenon. That was built after the time of Pisistratus. But he favors Athena, as you could tell from that quote that I just gave you, and he builds her a temple up there. He also builds a processional ramp, which I will show you in the next scene. He builds temples. He tries to build up the economy. And in the next scene, I will show you a bit of the processional ramp, which will be in the bottom right. And then I will talk briefly about another temple that he had built. Here's the processional ramp, which you can see down at the bottom right. When people move in a religious festival, it's called a procession. So people would process upwards to the top of the temple, certainly to honor the goddess Athena, who's the patron goddess of Athens. This is actually a Roman temple that you're looking at, but the foundation was built by Pisistratus. And in the background, you can see the Acropolis. So again, he was active in building various temples throughout Athens. Finally, I just want to show you this statue. This is called a herm. And these were set up during the time of Pisistratus and his sons Hippias and Hipparchus. It was considered to be a good luck symbol, and you can clearly see it's male. These were set up all over the city. They were used as mile markers, so it'd say you're 5 miles from downtown Athens. It was also used as moral maxims, so you'd see carvings on these with different messages. And a modern type of moral